clarify that I'm not an expert in this area at all. I'm a neophyte, but that's okay. I have to start somewhere. I'd just like to start with gratitude, first of all, to John and all GFI for hosting the event tonight. Thank you so much. And also to Ecological for making the connections to facilitate this to happen. And then there was an organising committee that worked for quite a while to get David to come to Ireland. So that includes Eilish Ward from NUIG and Sander from the Mindfulness Ireland board, and also to Martina Finn, who's here with us tonight from the Mindfulness Ireland Earth Holder community. So thank you to each of you for helping to make this event come tonight. As many of you know, I'm a documentary maker. My own work kind of delves into culture and ecology and spirituality and the connections between the two. But I'm also a meditation practitioner for almost 20 years. So David's work is amazing because it brings together all of the things that I feel really passionate about and I'm committed to in my own life and in my own work. I first came across David's work with this book in 2009. It was co-edited with Guillermo Dorje and with David Loy, yes, with John Stanley, former resident of Galway. And it's an amazing book. It has contributions by all the leading figures in the Buddhist world, the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, Joanna Macy, Robert Aitken. Amazing, incredible book. That came out in 2009, and I think it was ahead of its time, really. But it remains an essential point of reference, really. And then that brings me to the second book. I was fortunate to go on a retreat with David on the annual Ecodharma retreat at the Rocky Mountain Ecodharma Retreat Center, thank you, in Colorado, in 2022. So that was the first time we met in person. And that retreat really brought this book to life for me. It brought all the things that are important to me in my own life. Ecological activists there were mountain hikers, and there were meditators. And those are the three things that are really important to me in my life. So I was really fortunate that David has really worked really, really hard to bring those things together. Just in terms of a general contextualization for David's work, I think that it's important to see David's work, I think, as part of a groundswell of ecological thinking that's going on in the world right now. And it's taking place in communities of practice. It's taking place in people coming together in rooms like this. And I think it's so, so important that we come together in ways like this, as John referenced earlier with Turlock's amazing talk, coming together and crossing disciplinaries to form conversations to make this work. And even though you may not read about these things in the mainstream media, they're part of what Paul Holken describes as the most important social movement that the world does not yet know about. So the seeds form in a certain place. So I really see a gathering like this as really about planting seeds. And for me, David is an extraordinary cultivator of those seeds. So it's with a great pleasure that I welcome David Loy here to Dublin.
Thank you, Donald, for that very warm introduction. And it's really because of him and the people working with him that I'm able to be here this evening. First of all, let me just check with the mics. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. We were thinking, given the topic, that it might be good to start with a few minutes meditation to let our minds settle. So if you would please, maybe find a comfortable position and we'll meditate together for just a moment. given the way the room is arranged, I wonder if it works better if I stand up so people can see a bit better in the back of the room. Right now is the most dangerous time in the history of humanity. That, at least, is the opinion of Noam Chomsky in an interview a couple of years ago. Is it true? Well, I thought about it. I tried to think of a counterexample, and I couldn't. I think he's right. And in particular, I think we can see that the ecological crisis is the greatest crisis, the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced. Please notice that I don't mention the climate crisis. Actually, I don't like to talk about the climate crisis because I think that can be misleading. The climate crisis is really just the tip of an iceberg, a much larger ecological iceberg. And when you talk about climate, people think, oh, if we can just switch quickly enough to solar panels and so forth, renewable sources of energy, then we can continue with the kind of civilization that we have, and everything will be okay. And the reality, as I think most of you know, is it's not that simple. In addition to climate changes that we're experiencing more and more, there's also the fact that we're well in the middle now of what seems to be the sixth great extinction event. The fact that so many plant and animal species are disappearing, mostly due to human activity of one sort or another. Frankly, I'm shocked by the fact that today there are roughly half as many animals on Earth, wild animals, as there were 50 years ago. Where have they all gone? What's happened to them? Well, we know what's happened there. But in addition to that, think about loss of forests. Again, connected, but not reducible, right? Loss of forests, loss of topsoil, toxic pollutants in the air, and the earth, and the sea, and our bodies. Add your own to this list. Basically, what we're experiencing now is a broad challenge to the whole way that we understand ourselves and the whole way that our civilization is working. It really seems ironic to me that just after we have achieved what seems to be a truly global civilization, this civilization seems to be self-destructing. And frankly, my guess is I'm not telling you anything new that you don't already know or suspect for yourself. The ecological crisis has many dimensions to it. One of them, of course, is economic. We're still struggling with this issue. Are the kind of changes that we need to make compatible with late corporate consumer capitalism, given that we have an economic system that seems to need to keep growing if it's not going to collapse? Is that economic system compatible with what we need today? But of course, not only economics, what about political? The challenge of finding the political will that is needed in order to push through the changes that are necessary. Again, many other dimensions, social, psychological. Frankly, I wouldn't like to be a teenager today. They can see what's coming down, teenagers and other young people. But what about the philosophical, or as I prefer to say, the spiritual? Is there a spiritual dimension to this? And that's basically what I would like to talk with you about this evening. I think often we come across allusions, references to that possibility. But what I'd really like to try to do today is sort of unpack that and actually give it some substance, because I think we really need to realize that the ecological crisis is something that strikes very deeply at the whole meaning of what kind of civilization we have today and where it's going to go. And I'd like to do that by offering you a talk in two parts. Because what I think is fascinating is that there is a parallel, a profound and even precise parallel between what spiritual traditions like Buddhism have always had to say about our usual perennial personal predicament, that there's a parallel between that and our collective predicament in relation to the earth. Because it's fundamentally the same problem, I think. It has to do with the delusion of separation, the delusion that we're separate from other people, and today our collective delusion that we as a civilization are somehow separate from the earth. I think that's the delusion that our ecological crisis is really challenging us today. Does that make any sense? So 2 parts. First, what I'd like to do is offer you my kind of potted version, very different way of talking. I'm going to use Buddhist language, but what I have to say, I think, is not only something that Buddhists will appreciate. In fact, I'm not sure you have to be spiritual in any sense at all to appreciate this version of it. And then, having presented that, then to go ahead and show you the I think, pretty extensive parallels. Parallels so deep that it really seems to be the same problem, quite frankly. You can say our individual version is the mini problem or the micro problem, and I think our collective situation today in relationship to the earth is the macro version of exactly the same problem. So, part 1, our individual predicament, using Buddhist language. A lot of Buddhist teachings are pretty easy to understand. Things like the emphasis on impermanence, the emphasis on dukkha, or suffering, dissatisfaction, suffering understood in the broadest possible sense. I think we're all old enough to be familiar with that one way or another. But there's this other really essential Buddhist teaching, anatta, in the original language, usually translated as something like not self, no self. Because if you've studied or come across Buddhism, you probably come across this teaching, this denial of a separate self, which seems really very strange, kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? That seems to be the one thing that we start from, this feeling of self. And Buddhism says, well, no. In fact, that's the fundamental delusion. In fact, that's the fundamental delusion at the root of our dissatisfaction, at the core of our dukkha. I think this has always been a problem for everyone to understand, including people in the Buddha's day. But I think today we have perhaps because of things like child psychology, etc., maybe we have another way of articulating what I think the Buddha was pointing at. So talking about anatta, no self, I think we can say that the sense of self, especially the sense of separate self, the sense that there's a me inside, separate from the rest of you outside, right? That this sense of separation is, in fact, the result of a construction, that it is a psychological and social and indeed linguistic construction, right? So infants, babies, they're not born with this sense of separate self, as many of you know. It's something that develops as they grow up. We can say the sense of separate self is really a kind of a confluence of processes. It's the way that mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling, acting, reacting, it's the way that they work together to sustain this sense of separation. As we grow up, maybe our mother or our caretaker looks into our eyes and says our name, and we learn to see ourselves as she sees us. We have a name. We learn to identify with that name. We learn to use pronouns like I, me, mine, you, yours, and so forth. And in the process of doing that, it creates and sustains this illusion that there's a me inside, maybe behind the eyes or inside the ears, and the rest of the world is somehow outside. Where this gets really interesting, I think, is that because the sense of self is a kind of psychological construct, it means it doesn't have any reality or substantiality of its own. As I said, it's more of a process, or the way a bunch of mostly mental processes work together. And the really important implication from that is that the sense of self that we normally have is shadowed or even haunted by some sense of insecurity, fundamental dissatisfaction. The sense of self is shadowed by a sense of lack, L-A-C-K. By lack, I mean the feeling that something isn't quite right about me. Something isn't missing. Something is missing. I'm not good enough. Has anyone here ever felt anything like that? I mean, I think we can all identify with that pretty quickly. We've all had these moments, and sometimes more than moments, when we feel a fundamental sense of inadequacy. But how we understand this, it tends to not be in such an abstract form. It tends to take more precise. What I'm trying to say is we usually understand our lack as something in particular that we're lacking, rather than in the abstract sense. So I'm coming from the United States. I can't speak for how it works in Ireland, but one of the main senses of lack that we have in the US is, guess what? We're the richest country in the world, right? But still, lots of people feel, hey, I don't have enough money, right? Now, I have to say really quickly, there are a lot of people who don't have enough money. There's a lot of poverty. But nonetheless, there's an awful lot of middle class and above people who basically have pretty much what they need, but we are conditioned by our society to evaluate ourselves, to understand ourselves in terms of how wealthy we are, how many consumer toys we have, and so forth. So there's an awful lot of people wandering around who have this sense that, yes, there's something wrong with me. I don't have as much money as I need or as I deserve, that kind of thing, right? And I can see by your nods that maybe there's a little bit of that in Ireland too, sometimes, yeah. I tend to think that that's kind of the predominant lack project, as I call it. Sometimes I'll talk about a reality project, because another way to try to express this is to say that because of this insubstantiality that we feel, we don't feel real enough. But somehow if we get the money, then we feel more real. Another really important lack project, I think especially predominant today, given our technologies, is not being famous enough or not having enough of a reputation, right? I mean, think how much of our time we spend, if not looking at newspapers and magazines, well, online screens. And what do we notice? The same people, the same images tend to recur again and again, so we recognize the most famous politicians and the A-list Hollywood celebrities and so forth. And there's a sense that, hey, everyone sees them, they're kind of real, right? They're substantial. And if only I was like that, right? So this desire, this belief, right? Think of, internet influencers, isn't that the term? And how many young people, they see that. I remember when I grew up, it was we all wanted to be rock stars, but now I think it's internet influencers. And again, somehow the idea, if I have enough followers, if enough people know me, then somehow that's going to fill up my sense of lack, right? So that's another, I think, quite predominant lack project that many people are obsessed with. And one more that I think, frankly, I don't know if this is as true now, or I don't know if it's as true for my son's generation as my mother's, but the idea of the perfect romantic partner, or let's say romance, the idea that somehow there's this person out there, and if I just find that person and we're together, then everything is okay, the problem of my life will be solved, and they lived happily ever after, right? And of course, I think most of us here are old enough to know, well, it doesn't work quite that way. In fact, your problems might be just beginning, right? But it's interesting if you think about some of the great classics of romantic love. Think about Romeo and Juliet. All the stories about romance are always about the problems. You never get to they lived happily ever after, right? It's all about the things that get in the way, Because if you did get to the happily ever after, then you'd have to deal with all the, like, whose turn is it to wash the dishes or change the baby's nappies or whatever. In other words, that log project works only as long as you're not actually together. Because like the other two LAC projects, all of these preoccupations or obsessions are actually just symptoms of the fundamental problem. Which means that if your basic lack is, or your understanding is that you don't have enough money, well, I'm sorry to tell you, you will never have enough money to fill up that sense of lack. The same thing is true with fame. If you think fame is going to fill up your sense of lack, you will never be famous enough. And the same thing, of course, with romantic love, which is not to, I'm not criticizing anything about romance and sex and all that. They're great, but somehow the idea that that is going to solve the fundamental problem of your life, well, you're asking for trouble, right? Right. So does this make a sense? Basically, what I'm trying to say is give you a kind of different way of what Buddhism has always talked about, this dukkha, emphasis on suffering, and connect it with the delusion of a separate self, and how it is that the separate self, haunted by this sense of lack, is always trying to sort of make itself whole, fill up this bottomless pit at the core of our being, right? Two really important implications of this. One of them is inevitably, when we're caught up in this kind of way of thinking, there's a certain kind of self-obsession, right, or self-centeredness, because we're looking for that which is going to make us feel okay. So it encourages a kind of selfishness that actually reinforces the fundamental problem, the fundamental duality, the fundamental sense of separation. The other thing is that it also has important implications for how we experience time, right? Because due to our usual sense of lack, right now I'm not good enough, but hey, when I get all that money I think I need, or when I'm famous enough, or I find that perfect, then my life is going to be okay. So what it encourages us to do is live in the future. It encourages us to treat the present as always a means to some better end in the future when we get what we think we lack. Yeah. It's interesting, I find it personally interesting to watch how, once you have this kind of basic perspective, it can give you a lot of insight into what's motivating people and frankly why they do what they do, why people try to become happy and it doesn't ever seem to work. But where does Buddhism or some kind of spiritual path fit in here? Actually, I would call the Buddhist path a lack project. It's a lack project that can work. It doesn't always work because you can treat it as that same kind of future-oriented, when I'm fully enlightened, then everything is going to be great. Yeah, I can see all the Buddhists nodding here. So it can fall into that category that I've just talked about. But also, it can work in the sense that Buddhist practices such as meditation deconstruct the whole problem in kind of a sneaky way, right? Remember that the sense of lack is the other side, as it were, that haunts the sense of self. Well, what if you deconstruct the sense of self? Then doesn't that naturally deconstruct or let go of the sense of lack that goes along with that sense of self? And that's basically how the Buddhist path works. If we can see through the delusion of a separate self, then we're also at that time letting go, seeing through the delusions of the lack projects, right? Think about what's going on when we meditate. Well, a lot of things go on, a lot of thoughts, feelings, memories, plans, expectations, and so forth. But if we're meditating, what happens? They come to mind, but we don't identify with them. There's not the holding on to them in the same way. A thought comes to mind, and it goes away. And same thing with feelings and so forth. And because these mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling, acting are what compose the sense of self, by the act of not identifying with them, in a way you can say the sense of self is deconstructing when we're doing that. I'm not going to say that we deconstruct the sense of self. That would be a contradiction. Rather, in the meditation, it's something that happens. It's not, ultimately, meditation isn't something that we are doing, that I am doing, right? It's more, we're getting down to that level where we're not doing it. Some process is happening that takes on a life of its own. And in Buddhism, what can happen at a certain point is the sense of self lets go. And we can have this experience, what in Zen we call kensho, or this glimpse, this taste of enlightenment. You know, it's not something that we can do. That would be a fundamental contradiction. But it's something that can happen. As some teachers say, enlightenment is always an accident, but meditation makes you accident prone. Yeah? Yeah. There's a wonderful summary of this process by the 13th century Japanese Zen master Dogen Kigen. Probably the most famous thing he ever wrote was, quote, "To study Buddhism is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to realize your intimacy with the 10,000 things." Or you could say your non-duality with the world. There's another version that I actually like even more, not by a Buddhist, but by a Vedantin named Nisargadatta. In fact, my all-time favorite quotation. He said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that is wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life flows." Isn't that great? I love to repeat it. When I look inside and see that I'm nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life flows. He wasn't a Buddhist, but you know, that's the Buddhist teaching too, right? Wisdom and love, or as we more often say, wisdom and compassion, the two pillars of the Buddhist path. And he shows the connection between them too, that in that love, from this perspective, love isn't a feeling, right? It's rather a way of being, a way of living that embodies this wisdom of non-duality. And so that's the double challenge, the double practice, to realize this wisdom and to integrate it in how we actually relate to other people. And you can see too how this affects this question about the meaning of one's life. I mentioned before, when we're caught up in our lack projects, so often it's about me. It's me finding what I need to feel okay, right? It's that self-centeredness. It's pretty hard to avoid. But if we can let go of ourselves and realize our non-duality, then the whole meaning of our lives can transform. The delusion that my well-being is separate from your well-being, that doesn't work in the same way if I realize that I'm not really separate from you. And so this naturally in Buddhism leads to what we sometimes call as the bodhisattva path. Frankly, although it's not always expressed this way, I think it's something that naturally develops as we begin to wake up and realize our non-separation, our non-duality, as we see through the delusion of self and realize this self-preoccupation, even the self-preoccupation of my enlightenment or my serenity, as we begin to see through that, then we can become more engaged in the world, more concerned about offering what we can, right? I mean, if I'm not separate from the world, but I'm one of the ways the world manifests, then it seems to be a natural development to sort of to ask myself, well, given who I am, given my situation, what can I do to make this a better world for all of us? And I think that's at the core of the bodhisattva path, right? So what I've just presented is my take on what Buddhism is really talking about. A very different kind of language. For the Buddhists in the room, no talk about the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path, but I think it's another way of trying to articulate it that helps us see things in a fresh way, right? Does it make sense? What I'd like to do now then is basically show that everything I've said about our individual predicament is in fact exactly the same as our collective predicament now in relationship to the earth. That is exactly the same problem, a macro version of the same problem. We not only have individual senses of self, we have collective senses of self, right? So for example, I'm not only David, I'm a man, not a woman. I'm American, not Irish, and so forth. What I want to talk about now is, I think, our largest collective sense of self, that is to say, our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, or if you prefer, our now global contemporary civilization. Do we also have a sense of separation from the rest of the earth? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that we do, don't we? It's the same delusion of separation there. Is there a dukkha? Is there a suffering? Is there a dissatisfaction built into that? Well, let's think about that for a little bit. We didn't always have this sense of separation from the earth, right? I mean, we can think about how it developed. I think to some degree the first book of the Bible has contributed to it. You think about Genesis, and we're the only species made in the image of God, and so we have a special place, pinnacle of creation and all that. That's definitely some part of it. But it's important to distinguish the kind of civilization that we take for granted from some of the archaic civilizations. I'm thinking of something like Egypt or Mesopotamia, or the civilizations of the New World, Incas, Aztecs, Maya, because they all have a very interesting similarity. First of all, they're very hierarchical. Secondly, they all feel that they are natural, that their hierarchy, it's not, they don't have that sense of separation. They feel that the way their society is structured is in fact as natural as the ecosystems that they're embedded within. That's just the way things are. You might have revolutions and coups, and you might get rid of one king or emperor and replace him, it's usually a him, with another. But fundamentally, they sort of take their own political, social structure for granted. And there's also a religious side to it. When you look at their religions, our contemporary idea that, you know, you would separate the polity, the secular from the religious, they didn't have that at all. They, as far as they were concerned, what we would call their religion is just part of the way that they're structured. The people at the top have a special role in relating to the gods and the cosmic forces and that. So very, very different kind of understanding what we have. But there's one more aspect of those civilizations that I think is quite fascinating for everyone that I've been able to study. All of these civilizations believed not only that they were embedded, that they were part of the earth, but they believed that they had an important responsibility. They had a role to play in keeping the cosmos working. And that's why their rites and rituals were so important. The rituals weren't just for their own sake and for their own post-mortem salvation, whatever. They actually believed that this was essential. This was their role. This was what it meant to be a human being. Because we were part of something greater than who we are, we had a responsibility to do things to keep the universe working in a harmonious way. For example, maybe the most notorious example, the Aztecs, right? I think we all know they had a rather unsavory religious practice of dragging their war captives up to the top of the step pyramid and cutting out their still bleeding hearts with an obsidian knife. Why? Because they offered them to the sun god. Why would they do something gruesome like that? Because they believed you had to keep feeding the sun god, or the sun god would lose, I don't know if it was a him or a her or an it's, but let's just say the sun god would lose its way. It would become upset and lose its way. So they really believed that they were part of a cosmic cycle, that eventually things were going to fall apart. But by feeding the sun god in this way, they were kept for a while longer, right? Again, I don't think any of us would want to live in that kind of society, whether we were the executed or the executioner. But notice something here. By virtue of being a member of that society, they had a role, they had a meaning to their lives, however gruesome we may find it. They had a meaning to their lives that we today have lost. They knew why they were here, they knew what they needed to do. They had this sense of responsibility. And the reason I emphasize that is I think it's important to understand that essential to our modernity is the loss of that kind of role, of that kind of social security. We ask ourselves, why are we here? Well, we have an evolutionary explanation, right? We're accidents of genetic mutation. But what's the meaning of our lives? Well, enjoy ourselves, if we can, while we can, as long as we can, until we die. Well, that's what our economic system teaches us, but is that enough of a meaning of a role? Again, because we feel this sense of, we don't have any sense of being part of something greater than us, really. We can use the earth, we can use its resources, we can use it as a dump, but it's basically there to be used. It doesn't have any meaning or value in itself, it's just there to be exploited, right? And of course, that's what we do. We exploit it and we use it, but in terms of the actual meaning, what it means is the earth and everything on the earth, all the species, all its resources, that's the term we use, it's just a means. It has no value in and of itself. It's just a means for us to use in whatever way we want in order to get what we think we need. Does that ring true in any way? But just notice the contrast between these earlier civilizations. Because we're separate from the earth, we don't feel we're part of the earth in an essential way. In fact, let's go to Mars, right? Let's go to, actually I wouldn't mind it personally if Elon Musk did go to Mars, but the idea of, I think probably what's motivating that is, right, we've really messed up this earth, and so let's go to Mars and do it there again, or something like that, right? But this complete sense of separation and loss of any sense of responsibility because we don't feel that we're a part of something greater than ourselves, right? Does this make any sense? Please connect it with what I said before about our individual predicament, sense of separation, and that there's a dukkha, there's a suffering, there's a dissatisfaction built into that. And I'd like to summarize this, if I may, by reading you a quotation from a book that I suspect some of you have read, Yuval Harari, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. I'd like to read you just the last couple sentences, the very end of this book, which to me is a kind of brilliant summary of what I've just tried to say. He certainly puts it a lot better than I can, so let me read what he says. Despite the astonishing things that humans are capable of doing, we remain unsure of our goals, and we seem to be as discontented as ever. We've advanced from canoes to steamships to space shuttles, but nobody knows where we're going. We're more powerful than ever before, but have very little idea what to do with all that power. Worse still, humans seem to be more irresponsible than ever. self-made gods, with only the laws of physics to keep us company, we are accountable to no one. Consequently, we are wreaking havoc on our fellow animals and on the surrounding ecosystems, seeking little more than our own comfort and amusement, yet never finding satisfaction. And then the last sentence of the book. Is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want? Seems to me that's a pretty good description of our situation, and I think we can connect it with what I'm trying to emphasize, the sense of separation, that we feel that we're not a part of the earth, and therefore we don't have any responsibility to it. When I talked about our individual predicament, I talked about lack projects, right? Money, fame, romance, whatever. What is our collective lack project in response to this? If there's such a thing, and I think there is, and I think actually it's kind of obvious once we point it out. It is progress. Economic progress, political progress, technological progress, right? The fact that the world is getting better or it can get better, right? That's the promise of our economic system, right? Indefinite economic growth, more and more wealth for everybody, right? But why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? It's interesting, well, first of all, this whole idea, this myth of progress. When I grew up, and I can say the same for many of you the same age, more or less, that was a myth we could believe in, right? The world was getting better, right? Economic growth, democracy is spreading, and so forth. I think that's really, really hard for young people to buy into anymore, and I think that explains a lot of the stress, a lot of the anxiety that many of them are feeling because they don't believe in that story anymore. It's a story we've told ourselves. And that story doesn't work. It's not convincing because they can see all the problems that are arising, not only economically, the fact that so many young people don't have much option of, say, buying a house in the US, it's now so expensive, but fundamentally the ecological, right? They can see what's coming down. They can see that we're not doing what's really necessary to avoid the kinds of collapses that are becoming more and more likely, right? But can you see this myth of progress as the same as the individual lack projects in the sense that, guess what? Now isn't good enough, but don't worry, it's going to be better in the future. Again, this future orientation that's always treating the present as a means to somewhere better in the future. And if we give up the myth of progress, what's the alternative? What's left? Again, for some people, I think it's a kind of meaninglessness or nihilism, right? Does this make any sense? What's the solution? As somebody who talks about ecological problems a lot, that's the kind of critical question. Sometimes I dread it, right? Buddhism actually, if you don't know, Buddhism really doesn't have anything very specific to say about that. Nor should it. I mean, the Buddha lived, 2,400 years ago in Iron Age India, a very different time and place. The problems we have today, they were not their problems, and so it's not surprising that Buddhist texts don't really give us anything specific to help us there. But what I am trying to do is sort of draw out some of the implications, especially this parallel between what Buddhism has always said about our individual dukkha problem and our collective one today. But let's see, can we explore a little bit, right? On the individual level, Buddhism offers a solution. Meditation and other types of mindfulness practices, especially, that can lead to this experience of letting go of ourselves, letting go of the delusion of separation, and realizing our non-duality with each other and the world, right? What about on the collective level? Thich Nhat Hanh said, quote, "The Buddha attained individual awakening. Today, we need a collective awakening to stop the course of destruction." Sounds great. What does it mean, right? I mean, I think he's right, but still, what does he mean? What might that involve? Does it mean that everyone has to, if not become a Buddhist, start meditating and start waking up in the Buddhist sense? If so, it's going to be a very long time, and I don't think we have that kind of time, right? What might a collective awakening actually involve? And is it maybe already happening? Is maybe the fact that all of you on this beautiful day, beautiful evening, have actually made the sacrifice to come to a talk in a room that's a little bit too warm, to listen to a talk like this? What does that point to? What does that suggest? What am I trying to point to here? I'm thinking of a book by an American called Paul Hawken. Actually, he's a long-term Zen student, but he wrote a really interesting book called Blessed Unrest. Anybody here ever hear of it or read it? Yeah? See if I can find the relevant title here. Yep. Blessed Unrest, How the Largest Movement in the World Came into Being and Why No One Saw It Coming. What he refers to is a worldwide movement for social justice and ecological sustainability. And basically what he says in the book is that right now there are a very large number of groups, organizations, that have sprung up on this earth, on this planet. And it's not like a communist conspiracy or anything like that. Rather, there's a certain kind of organic upspringing to them, working for these issues. And originally in the book, I think he estimated, he made some research, and he estimated that there were approximately 1.5 million all around the world, 1.5 million groups like this. And since then, I don't know if more have developed or he just counted differently. Now he says well over 2 million groups like this, most of them small. But he points out something really interesting, that, hey guys, these aren't lack projects in the usual sense, that why are people doing this? In most cases, they're not doing it for themselves. They're doing it for other people. They're doing it for the earth. Then you could say these groups are acting kind of like bodhisattvas, acting in kind of a selfless way. And the most amazing thing for me about the work is that the way he compares this movement of movements with the immune systems of our bodies. These groups are springing up like the immune system of the earth, springing up to defend and heal itself. Interesting how that connects with this idea of non-duality. Maybe it's not even a realization, a conscious realization, but the idea that maybe without even knowing what motivates us, we are experiencing the implications of this non-separation from the earth, right? That somehow in us, in our efforts, and I think we can include the people here because, again, why are we here? What really motivates us? Do we actually know what's going on? Especially if it's not for some sort of self-oriented, self-centered sort of reason. What's really motivating us to do what we can to help this healing? As Hawkins says, there's no guarantee this movement will be successful. Immune systems can fail, right? Think of HIV, AIDS, and so forth. But he really thinks that something like this is going on. And it makes a lot of sense if we think of enlightenment, like Buddhism talks about enlightenment. You know, sometimes we use the word, and so we think of enlightenment as like a state of being or something. What if we understand enlightenment more as like a process? A developmental process, then can we understand this movement of movements that he's talking about as part of this process whereby the earth is trying to heal itself? To me, this connects too with a very old question in Buddhism. If there's no separate self, if the sense of a me inside that's separate from you and the rest of the world outside, if that's a delusion, then hey, who or what becomes enlightened? That's a good question. There's a wonderful story in the Buddhist canon where after his own awakening, the Buddha was challenged by Mara, who's kind of the symbol of evil or delusion. And Mara says to the Buddha, so you think you're enlightened, right? Well, who verifies that? Who authorizes? Maybe it's just your delusion. What's really going on there? And what does the Buddha do? With his right hand, of course, he's sitting down on the ground, right? He touches the earth. And he says, the earth is my witness. What does that mean? I don't know. But I get a strange kind of feeling every time I tell this story that the Buddha is acknowledging his non-duality with the earth. That his enlightenment isn't just his own individual ego accomplishment. It's a letting go. It's the earth. It is the whole. It's the biosphere. It's the whole that's manifesting, that's coming to awakening, that's coming to this deep realization about who he is, acknowledging, realizing his non-duality with the earth, right? And I just wonder, when we look at the kind of immune system response that Paul Hawken is talking about, can we see that something like that is going on now, that our concern, our individual and collective concern, could do what we can to understand and address the kind of ecological crisis we face today? Can we say that is the earth acting in and through us? And it seems to me that it is. Does this make any sense? Can you see the parallel, how well the parallel works, right? Individual sense of separation, collective sense of separation. That there's a dukkha, that there's a dissatisfaction, that there's a problem built in there. I mean, there's all kinds of problems with our ecological crisis, but the problem that I'm focusing on is the fundamental one of meaning, that if we feel separate, right? If we feel separate, that there's individually we become preoccupied with a lack project so we can feel more whole. and that doesn't work. In the same way, collectively too, I think we as a civilization, right, we've worked for more and more consumerism, more and more exploitation of the earth, and that doesn't seem to be working either. And although I neglected to mention this earlier, it seems to me interesting how if we understand our collective problem in this light, the kind of ecological situation we have today is really kind of unavoidable, inevitable to some degree. Because again, our economic, social preoccupation with growth. Well, guess what? The earth isn't growing in that way, so sooner or later, we're going to bump up against the limits of the biosphere. And I think that's happening now, and that's what we call the ecological crisis. And I think you can see too why I think we have to understand this as a spiritual crisis, a spiritual challenge as well. It's not just about changing our sources of energy, making them more renewable, but something that really challenges our way of understanding, individually and collectively, challenges our way of understanding the earth. We are part of the earth. We are one of the many species that works for that. We are, how to say it? We are one of the many, many species whereby the earth is manifesting, expressing itself. And somehow the idea that we're special, that our well-being is separate from the well-being of others and we don't have to be concerned about the other species, that's the fundamental delusion. But I think we are special in one way, that we can actually wake up in the way that we've just been talking, right? That we can wake up and realize our non-duality with the earth, realize that our own well-being is not separate from the well-being of all the other species, separate from the well-being of the biosphere. And we can learn to transform how we live so that we live in a way that embodies that embodies that concern for harmony, compassion, living sustainably on the earth. So that maybe if we really understood the possibilities here, could we understand ourselves as a bodhisattva species, a species that realizes, hey, we're not separate from all the other species, we're interconnected, and take the responsibility that goes along with that. Truly, this is the most dangerous time in human history. And we all have the misfortune and the privilege and the responsibility that goes along with realizing that and trying to live in a way that embodies that. One of my favorite Zen stories, very simple. A student asked Unman, what is the fruit of a lifetime of practice? Right? We meditate for years, for decades. What's the fruit of a lifetime of practice? And Unman said, responding appropriately. That's all. Beautiful, right? It's not about transcending this world, qualifying for some better place, eternity with somebody in heaven, whatever. It's learning how to be embedded and respond appropriately here and now, right? Wonderful. But I do think that points not just to the way that, Buddhism suggests, but I think that's the challenge for all of our spiritual traditions today, to get over this other duality of trying to qualify, this preoccupation with death and what happens after death, and realizing that the spiritual path is really not about transcending this world physically for some kind of other reality, but rather transcending our usual way of experiencing the world. But that's the kind of transcendence that's necessary. And frankly, it seems to me that if we're going to respond appropriately to the ecological crisis, whatever that may be, it seems to me that our religions are going to have to move in this direction too. And I think I've talked enough. And I think I should shut up and maybe open the floor for discussion. What do you think? Do we do that? Thank you. Thank you.